stage my friend, the friend of Emirates Literature Foundation, Mr. Rehan Khan.
Wow, Daisy, that was a bit too short. I was expecting a little bit more there, but okay, we are good to go. Right, thank you for those who have come. You know, if you ask people today, like how they are doing, right? Most people will say, oh, okay, I've been told to stand this side. let me restart. Okay, so if you ask most people today, like, how are you doing, right? The general answer tends to be that, oh, I'm really busy, okay? That's the standard answer. Most people say, oh, I'm really, really busy. And they're generally busy because they're running around with their smartphones. So they're on their smartphone, and they're running around, and they're talking to someone, and then maybe they're actually in a queue, right? And they're on their smartphone, or maybe they're actually sitting with their friends, but they're also on their smartphone at the same time. So what's actually happening is that the majority of people, when they're on the smartphone and doing something else, they're actually multitasking, right? They're doing two things at once. But the interesting thing about multitasking is that according to Professor Earl Miller, who's a neuroscientist at MIT, he says that when people think they're multitasking, what they're actually doing is that they're just switching between tasks. They're switching between tasks. They're not actually multitasking. And every time they switch between tasks, actually there's a cognitive cost, right? So there's a cognitive cost. So the question is, right, what's that cognitive cost? So the cognitive cost is the fact that every time what multitasking does is that it fires off the stress hormone cortisol, as well as the fight or flight hormone adrenaline. And so as you multitask, these neurochemicals go off in your brain. And your brain becomes flooded with these neurochemicals, so much so that your brain starts to become like a bit foggy and a bit misty. And if you read the biographies of people who've been very senior in government or very senior in large corporations, what they'll tell you is that some of the worst decisions they ever made was when they had too much going on. There were too many things going on, right? Now, what's also happening is that the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that we need to help us stay focused, right? So the prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that we need to help us stay focused. That becomes easily distracted. So for example, you have a new notification on your phone, right? The prefrontal cortex gets easily distracted. Or something new or shiny or blingy pops up, the prefrontal cortex gets distracted. Now the problem is that every single time the prefrontal cortex gets distracted, another neurochemical goes off in the brain, which is called dopamine. And dopamine is often known as it's like brain candy. It's like sweets. And we all love sweets, right? But we know too many sweets is actually really bad for you, right? Okay, so you've got dopamine firing off as you're jumping between one thing and another thing. So the issue here is that multitasking feels like fun. Okay, when you're multitasking, you feel, oh, I'm really busy, I'm jumping around. But you ask most people how they do feeling at the end of the day, and they say, you know, I'm really tired, there's not enough hours in the day, I can't get things done, right? I can see the nods around me. So you feel that, I feel that, right? You feel that, right? So a couple of years ago, the conventional wisdom, i.e. the standard belief, was that people who were multitaskers were actually more effective. So that was the conventional wisdom. People believed that multitaskers were much more effective. So a couple of researchers at Stanford, what they did was that they did a test, Ophir, Narson, Wagner. They tested that hypothesis. So they said, were multitaskers much more effective because they were better at ignoring irrelevant information? So is that why multitaskers were more effective? Because they could ignore irrelevant information. And what they realized when they tested that, that wasn't the case. Multitaskers were actually not effective, okay? Then they tested a second hypothesis, which was, were multitaskers actually better at organizing and storing information. Is that why they were, better, more effective? And what they realized was that they weren't. That was also not true. So they tested a third hypothesis. And the third hypothesis was that, well, were actually multitaskers better at task switching? Were they better at multitasking? And what they realized was actually no, they weren't. And they found that actually the light multitaskers were actually much more effective than the heavy multitaskers. So what the researchers Ophir, Nass, and Wagner said was that the heavy multitaskers, they couldn't keep things separate in their mind. So they were working on something, but they were thinking about the past or they were thinking about the future. And what the research shows is that even if you're at home having dinner with your family, 47% of the time, your mind is wandering. You're not present. You're thinking about the past or you're thinking about the future. So this is the problem. The heavy multitaskers couldn't get the work done because they were thinking about something else, right? Now, for those of you who work in organizations and companies or you have your own business, now think about that, right? So if you're a heavy multitasker, not only are you being less effective, but what's also happening is that you're creating undue stress by releasing cortisol and adrenaline into your brain as well. Okay. There was another really interesting study done by Gloria Mark, who's a professor of information science at the University of California. So her and her team worked with some large global corporates like Boeing and Intel and Microsoft and various others. And they installed a logging program in the computer of thousands of users with their permission. So they said to the users, we want to install a logging program which sees how often, what you do on your screen. And what they found was that some of the users were actually switching between programs and applications every 40 seconds, right? And the average was every 2 or 3 minutes. People kept switching from one thing to another thing. Now remember, every single time you switch tasks, there's a cognitive cost, right? Cortisol and adrenaline going off. Now what the research also showed was that when people were actually focusing, so when they're actually really focused and doing some deep work, maybe you're in a deep Excel model or you're writing an HR policy, whatever it might be, if people got distracted when they were doing that, it would take 25 minutes to get back to the same level of cognitive depth they were at before they got distracted. So think about that, you're deep in work and then suddenly your smartphone is very alluring and you just pick it up, right? And you disappear into a black hole for a while. It's going to take you 25 minutes to get back to that depth that you were at before, right? Or if you're sitting in an open plan office and people are coming up and distracting you, potentially you could be losing hours and hours a day. And what the research also showed was that when people went back, they would end up doing 2.26 other things before they went back to the original task. So potentially you could be losing hours and hours just through this kind of engagement. Okay. So now one of the biggest sources of distraction for all of us, right, is email, right? Email and notifications. So there was a study done by Professor Glenn Wilson, and he was a former professor at King's College in London. And he did a study on email notifications. So when you're on your computer and you're working on something, right? And then you can see that little notification in the corner that you have email, right? What the research showed was that if you're working on something and you're distracted, your attention is drawn to that email notification, then your effective IQ drops by 10 points. Your effective IQ drops by 10 points. Now put that in context. So what Professor Wilson says is that when people smoke marijuana, and of course I'm not recommending anyone smoke marijuana, but what Professor Wilson says is that when people smoke marijuana, their effective IQ drops 6 points. But when they have the email notification that is dividing their attention, their effective IQ is dropping by 10 points. Now again, think about that. You're trying to get something done, and you're lowering your ability because the horsepower your brain is generating has got less. Why are we making life difficult for ourselves, right? Okay. There was another study done which was looking at what happens when we're trying to learn something and we're multitasking. So Professor Russ Poldrack at Stanford, he did a study to look at when school children were doing their homework, right, and they were watching television, okay, what they found was that the information from the homework got coded into the striatum. Now, the striatum is the part of the brain that is responsible for learning a new skill or learning a new procedure. So, for example, I learned how to juggle, right? Learning how to juggle is a new skill, it's a new procedure. That gets coded into the striatum. But when the same school children were doing their homework and they weren't watching the television, then the information from their homework got coded into the hippocampus. Now, the hippocampus is the part of the brain that's responsible for cataloging, storing, and most importantly, retrieving the information, right? So when the children could then, it got cataloged, stored, and retrieved effectively. The same applies to all of us who work in organizations and companies, right? If you're trying to do something and you're learning something new, but you're also trying to do something else, then actually the information is going to the wrong part of the brain. And then you think, oh, I can't remember. Of course you can't remember. It's in the wrong part of the brain. It's not in the right place, right? That's why you can't remember, right? Because you're trying to do two things at once, yeah? Okay. Right, so the question is, right, how did we get into this situation today where we have so many digital distractions around us, right? I started working in the corporate sector back in the 1990s. And, I didn't imagine that in 2022, we'd be in such a situation where there would be so many digital distractions around us, shattering our attention into like 1,000 shards of glass. I didn't imagine that to be the case. And when the late Steve Jobs launched the first iPhone, the iPhone 1 in 2007, I, like many, and perhaps many of you here, went out and bought the first iPhone as well. And when Jobs launched the first iPhone, he said that the killer app is making calls. Now, for those of you who are a bit younger, you're probably thinking, why is that a killer app? Because in 2007, the majority of people had like a Nokia or a Motorola, right, or an Ericsson phone, and then they would have an iPod for their music. And so what the iPhone did is that it made the iPod into a normal, regular phone. That's why So, I bought that. A lot of other people bought it as well. If you had said to me in 2007, Rehan, in 2022, the average iPhone user will be picking up their device 150 times a day, right? The research varies. Sometimes it says 200, sometimes it says 100. Let's just go for 150. If the average iPhone user or smartphone user is picking their phone up 150 times a day, I would be like, are you crazy? Why would I want something like that? That's mad. Now, of course, I appreciate if it's part of your job, someone is a field engineer and they're out at site and they have to use a smartphone. Someone is a medical professional, they're out at site, they have to use a smartphone. You're using Google Maps, maybe you're driving. I get that. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that, right? Because you're using it for a function. But that's the exception. That's not the norm. When you're not doing something which is utilitarian, right, do we really need to be picking our smartphone up 150 times a day? Really? Right? So the question is then, how did we get to this point? How is it that, did this happen by accident or did it happen by design? Did someone design it? Maybe after this talk a little bit later, you guys want to watch a clip on 60 Minutes, which is a documentary. And the 60 Minutes clip, there's one called Brain Hacking, right? Brain Hacking. And it's with Tristan Harris, who's a former Google engineer and whistleblower. And what he says is that the smartphone, okay, is like a slot machine, right? It's like a slot machine that you find in a casino and so on. And he says that people are being programmed, because what essentially is happening is that, you and I are on our smartphones and we're doing something here. But on the other end of the smartphone, there are thousands of software engineers looking at how are we using our phone and how can they make it much more addictive, right? So it's not just you. There are thousands of people at the other end looking at how can we make this much more addictive, okay? So Tristan Harris has come out and said that. A few other people have as well. Here's a quote from Sean Parker. Now, Sean Parker is the founding president of Facebook, right? In 2017, he said, and I quote, "The thought process that went into building these applications, Facebook being the first of them to really understand it, that thought process was all about how do we consume as much of your time and conscious attention as possible. And that means that we need to give you a little dopamine hit every once in a while because someone liked or someone commented on something that you put out, right?" So these are leading people from the industry who are talking about the fact that the way our smartphones and the way our devices and the way our digital lives are designed, it's not by accident, it's by design. So very much the manner in which our digital lives operate today has been crafted and has been engineered to serve the interests of a select group of technology investors. Let me say that again. So the way in which our digital lives operate today has been crafted and engineered to basically serve the interests of a select group of technology investors. It hasn't been crafted and engineered to serve the interests of you as an individual so you can become more productive. It hasn't been crafted and engineered to serve the interests of the organizations we work for, because organizations are leaking productivity off the bottom line. And it definitely has not been crafted and engineered to serve the interests of a more wholesome and peaceful home life. Right? We all know that. Everyone's nodding. Of course, it hasn't, right? So when we start to realize this, that this is actually by design, right? It's not accident, it's by design. It's actually a hopeful position. Because once you have the language to understand what's going on, you can then make the change. It's when you don't have the language, you don't have the words, you don't know why do I always feel tired? Why do I always feel like I'm jumping around too much? Why can't I concentrate? Why am I being distracted? When you can't articulate that, then you feel down, right? But as soon as you realize it, it's very hopeful because you can do something about it, right? So it's a hopeful position to be in. Now, I've mentioned dopamine a couple of times. I mentioned it at the beginning, and as you just saw, you know, the founding president of Facebook mentions it, right? So what exactly is dopamine, right? So dopamine was discovered by a couple of neuroscientists, Olds and Milner, at McGill University in Canada in the 1950s. And what they realized was that they put some electrodes, they connected some electrodes into the limbic part of the brain of some rats. And whenever they sent a signal, okay, into the limbic part of the brain of these rats, the rats would really enjoy it. The rats found pleasure. So every single time that electrical signal went into the limbic part of the brain for these rats, the rats really enjoyed it. So what they did was that they put a lever, right? They put a lever in the cage of these rats. And so the rats could self-administer the electrical current. And what they found was that the rats loved it so much that they just kept on pressing it. They forgot to eat, they forgot to drink, they forgot to sleep. And the rats kept pressing, getting that dopamine hit until they basically got so exhausted that they keeled over and died. Right? These rats died. Now you're saying probably, yeah, but Rehan, come on, those are rats, right? You know, we're human beings. We don't do that kind of thing. Surely not, right? Okay. So I'd point you to a really interesting study by Dr. Natasha Dow-Scholl. So she's written a book called Addiction by Design. Addiction by Design. And what she did a study on basically gamblers in Las Vegas at casinos. And what she found was that people play the slot machine, right? In a casino, they kind of pull the lever. These days it's all touchscreen, But what she found was that the people who are playing the slot machine, they were pulling the lever 600 times per hour, right? 600 times per hour. And they were so like jacked into the game that some of the users, some of the adults would just wear adult pants, so they didn't need to go to the restroom. I know it's pretty like gross, right? Because they were so in their game, yeah? Because they're getting a dopamine hit. They're getting a dopamine hit constantly, constantly, constantly. Now, what Dr. Scholl's study shows is that the same design principles that are used in slot machines, in casinos, are used in games like Candy Crush, Angry Birds, and all of these like highly addictive games on Facebook or smartphones that people keep on wanting to play. Because it's doing the same thing. It's firing off that dopamine in your brain, right? It's doing the same thing, right? So, okay. So all of this stuff is happening. And as I say, you can feel either depressed by it, or actually you can say, no, actually now I understand it. I can do something about this, right? It's a hopeful position. I can do something about this. So the question is then, we all have limited time, right? And when you have limited time, you have to make some choices. What do I want to focus on? So Timothy Wilson, who is a professor of psychology at the University of Virginia, what he said was that the brain receives something like 11 million bits of 11 billion bits of sensory 11 million, forgive me, bits of sensory information per second. But the brain can only process about 40. So you're receiving 11 million bits of sensory information, but your brain can only process about 40. So the question here is then, your brain is constantly sorting. What should I focus on? What should I not focus on? So Sean Aker, who wrote The Happiness Advantage, he said that, look, focus on the positive signals, right? Because when you focus on things that are positive, you're much more productive, you can get more done, you can, get a promotion, blah, blah, blah. So he goes into all the data about this. And what he says that he makes a difference between a signal, which is something we should focus on, and noise. And noise is something he says that we should ignore. And he says there are 4 types of noise. The first type of noise is something which is unusable. So for example, say you hear about some tragedy that's taken place on the other side of the world. Now, unless you're from that community on the other side of the world, or you are planning to help those people, right? Or maybe you want to pray for them or whatever, that to you is noise, right? Because if you're not from that community, you're not planning to help them, right? It's noise, yeah? And today, because of the way the smartphone works, you switch your smartphone on, and the entire world's sorrows come crashing down on your shoulders. You don't need to know that. You have to see what is your circle of influence, right? Your family, your community, your society. That's where you can affect change. I'm talking about how can you affect change. When you look at all the world's problems, it disempowers you. You feel, I can't do anything, and it creates frustration. So focus on what you can do and understand what is noise and what is a signal, right? The second type of thing that he says is that then you have noise which is untimely. So something that's untimely, maybe you're going on vacation or holiday somewhere in 6 months' time, and you're checking the currency updates, like what's the currency exchange rate? You don't need to know, right? You don't need to know. Just check when you go. And then you have noise which is hypothetical, like a 5-day weather forecast, right? It has a 53% chance of being accurate. It's hypothetical. Don't spend all your time on it. And then you've got things which are basically a distraction, right? So something that takes you away from your purpose or your core work, right? So how do we then actually, bring our attention back? How do we focus on what we should be focusing on, right? There's a process called meta-awareness. Now, meta-awareness is basically thinking about, what am I thinking about? right? So meta-awareness is thinking about, what am I thinking about? Because if you find that you're thinking about something that's not in the present, you need to draw your attention back. Be present. You know, for those of you who've had the privilege to have a great teacher, you know, whatever kind of teacher they might be, a religious teacher, a spiritual teacher, any kind of teacher that you've had, when you're in their presence, right, they're present. And there's that energy that feeds off them. Why? Because they're giving you their full attention. But when you're with people who are vacuous, that you're talking to them, but they're like, you don't feel great, right? You don't feel great because the person's not giving you their attention. Great teachers, great people give you their full attention. Okay? So meta-awareness is thinking about, what am I thinking about right now? Okay? Now, Chris Bailey, who wrote Hyperfocus, he said, look, there are 3 kinds of tasks, right? So we generally have. So we have some tasks which are habitual tasks, right? You do it by habit. So for example, you know, you're in the kitchen and you're, you know, just wash the dishes, you just put something on the cooker. Okay, you can multitask there. There's no problem, right? Because it's a habit, right? It's a habitual task. No problem at all. You can multitask. Then you have tasks which require your focus, and then there's a habitual task. So for example, like when I often listen to a podcast, okay, or I'm listening to an audiobook, I'm also ironing my shirts, right? Because ironing my shirts is a habitual task, whereas listening to the podcast, that requires my focus. Likewise, you could be driving your car and you're listening to a podcast, no problem. However, if you're driving somewhere new, right, and you're trying to read the directions, or you're looking at Google Maps, your ability to recall what was on the podcast will greatly diminish. You won't be able to remember it because you can't do 2 things like that at the same time, right? And then you've got tasks which require your complete attention. So if you're in a work environment, maybe you're doing a performance review with an employee. Maybe you're creating a detailed financial model. Maybe you're writing a sales plan. You know, whatever it might be, right? That requires your complete focus. So when you're doing tasks, think about, is it a habitual task? Is it something that requires your full attention? Okay. Now, why is all this really important? And why am I making it into such why am I putting so much emphasis on this, right? Is because certainly what I saw in my own career and what I've seen in companies I work for, and you see in the market generally, is that we are losing the ability to do what Professor Cal Newport of Georgetown University calls, we're losing the ability to do deep work. So deep work is essentially it's professional activities that you do which is performed in a distraction-free environment. When you're not distracted, and when you do that, you push your mental faculties, you push your cognitive capabilities to their limit. And when you do that, you create value for yourself as an individual, yeah, because you raise your performance. You create value for the organization that you work for, right? And it's also hard to repeat. It's hard for someone just to copy it, right? But you can only do that kind of deep work when you're in a distraction-free environment. Now, the kind of deep work will obviously vary in different jobs. Like if someone is sitting in a call center, they're not going to do that much deep work, maybe 5%. If someone is a professor in academia, probably 90%. If someone is a lawyer and they're drafting, maybe 60, 70%. Certainly in the kind of job I do, 60, 70% of what I do is deep work, right? But what's actually happening today, there's a study from McKinsey, and McKinsey said that 60% of the time, knowledge workers spend on electronic communications. And 30% of that time, they spend on email. And of that 30% of the time they spend on email, right, 40% of those emails have nothing to do with them. Then don't you read them? Now, again, think about that, the loss of productivity for you as an individual. Multiply that by thousands of employees for organizations, right? Organizations are losing, they're leaking value off the bottom line. okay? So what is actually happening, what we're doing, a lot of us, you know, I include myself in this before as well, we're doing shallow work, okay? Shallow work is just like logistical stuff. Oh, I'll forward this email, and I say to my colleague, oh, any thoughts on this, right? Yeah, we've all done that. I've done it, right? I can see some of you have done it as well. We've all done it. Any thoughts, right? You're basically not using your own brain, and you just like pass it on to someone. And so what's actually happening is that we're doing logistical kind of stuff. That's easy to replicate, okay? Anyone can do it. We live in a world today where machine learning algorithms, AI, in the very near future, okay, a lot of this stuff is going to do that shallow work, right? I work in a technology company, right? A lot of those machine learning algorithms is going to do that shallow work. So if we as individuals have got used to doing that kind of work, do you really think we will be employed or employable? I don't think so, right? So again, it's realigning our thinking. You know, what do we want to be known for? We want to be known for doing deep work, right? Not shallow work, which is easily replicable. Okay, right. Let me actually just finish with this one. So just a couple of tips, and then I'll open it up for some questions that you may have as well. Okay, because I think we've got about 10 minutes. So one way to try to like focus a little bit is when you get up in the morning, don't switch your computer on and just start work straight away, right? That's the worst thing to do because you'll just get into it, right? Rather, write down on a piece of paper or your notepad and think about, you know, what's the 3 most important things that you need to do. And so this is from actually J.D. Mayer, who wrote the Getting Things Done. And write down, you know, what are the 3 most important things I need to do. And then throughout the day, keep focusing on that. Now, these might be tasks, they might be projects, they might be milestones. And then throughout the day, keep thinking about, am I doing the 3 most important things today? Okay? And so when you plan your schedule and you plan your calendar, the day before, look at your calendar and say, do you know what? I've got these meetings, or I'm on these Zoom call and Teams call, okay, and I've got all this meeting back to back. You know, people have got back-to-back meetings, right? Okay, but how much thinking time are you giving yourself, right? Because when your brain is constantly receive, it can't make the neural connections. And what you'll find, I'm sure, is that your best ideas come when like you're in the shower or you're just going for a walk. Why? Because your brain wasn't receiving. And when your brain's not receiving, it's calm. And when it's calm, it's making the neural connections, right? It's making the neural connections. So in your daily schedule, give yourself time where you can go for a walk. Give yourself time where you can just look out the window, right? Because remember, it's quality. It's not quantity. You know, we live in the reign of quantity. You know, and that's actually a very famous book, The Reign of Quantity. We live in a time where it's all about quantity. However, we always know quality, right? We know quality is what wins it, right? So give yourself time. And then, you know, you might have a few other tasks and so on as well to think about. So that's just like one suggestion that you may want to have a think about. So what I've been speaking to you for the last kind of like half an hour has been very much about distraction. So it's from a book I've written called Distracting Ourselves to Death. It's a very famous book by Neil Postman, who was in the 70s, in the 80s, and he was a professor at NYU, and it was called Amusing Ourselves to Death. So I kind of like ripped off the title a little bit. And it's Distracting Ourselves to Death. So some of the stuff I've spoken to you about today is actually, it's more explained in the book. And it's really aimed at, you know, knowledge workers, people who work with information. And how can you focus on what's, you know, important? How can you focus on your purpose? I have a couple of other books if you're interested. So I write historic fiction and then some fantasy as well. So I think the books are available I think they're available for sale around the corner from Magrudy's. But let me stop there, because if you do have questions, please put your hands up. Okay, and there's a mic here. Daisy, I think this gentleman here. Yep.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation, Rehan. I have a question for you which was already weighing heavily on my mind, and you happened to touch upon the topic. So I'm not a father, but there are other children in the family, and I discovered to my, because for some time due to COVID I was not able to travel enough, children do not want to give up on their mobile phones, and you cannot force them to even, spend quality time with you. You take them out on a meal, they're glued to their phones. As an adult, it was already very disturbing. And from your lecture, I gather that in the long run, it will impact everybody's productivity too if somebody is glued to phone all the time. So I have two related questions. One question is that now in this time and age when everybody is onto their phone all the time, are we looking at a period of when the human beings are really less productive as a race? And secondly, what can we do to help out the children, or because I really see no way around that. Thank
Okay,
you.
great. So as to what will happen in the future, I don't know. As to what we can do about it, I think I have a suggestion. So, look, if you want to break a bad habit, and we all have bad habits, okay, you have to fill it with a good habit. If you say to someone, take a digital detox, go cold turkey, bad idea. Because what will happen, they'll stop using their technology for a weekend or for a week, but they'll have a craving. And the craving will draw them back. So what you need to do, you have to ask yourself an existential question. You have to ask yourself the most important question that you will ever ask in your life. What is my purpose? What is my purpose? Right? Now, for example, some people's purpose outside of maybe work, maybe that they want to be a painter, someone wants to be a sculptor, someone wants to bring up a family, someone wants to be a cyclist, whatever it might be, someone wants to do community work. If you know this is my purpose, this is what I want to do, then you start to fill your time with that. So maybe someone wants to learn to play the guitar. They start to learn that, right? Now, when you start to fill your time with that thing that is your purpose, that you want to do, then the fact that you're not on your devices, the time will start to go down. And you'll realize that it was frivolous, it was time wasting, I didn't need to do it. So you must really find something that you want to do. Focus on that. And then you will break the habit easily. So as a writer, I use technology. I'm not against technology, right? I use technology. But I use technology as a novelist to try and become a better novelist. So if you like cycling, you use the cycling technology like Strava and stuff to become a better cyclist, right? But technology by itself has no value. It only has value if it helps you become what you want to be. So find out what that is. It's a hard question. It might take you 1 or 2 years. You might go down blind alleys, but take the first step in the journey, because it's the journey, right? And it's also you learn on that journey. That you will find your way, and then the digital distraction, it goes away, because it's just frivolous, right? Okay. There's a couple of questions here.
Thank you very much for your presentation and your knowledge. I would like to ask regarding, I have many disciplines to do. For example, art, architecture, 3D modeling, Photoshop, design, logo designs, all of these things. And it created a very big noise mentally. I don't know what to focus, what to develop, and I'm master of everything and master of nothing at the same time. So how can I focus my knowledge and to be professional in one specific thing? How to focus, and what are the guidelines to go with that? Thank you
Great.
very much.
So when you have a lot of different things, think of yourself like a craft person, right? So someone who is a craft person, like maybe they make woodwork, they do steel work, they do marble work, right? A craftsperson focuses on quality. They focus on creating something which is so good that people will say, wow. So when you're in your industry, your work should speak for you when you're not in the room, right? That's the best promotion. It's not like promoting yourself. That's very shallow, right? But your work should be so good that people talk about you when you're not there, right? So think about it from that perspective. How can you then, what do you need to focus on? What do you need to prioritize? Because again, it's not being great at everything. It's being known for one or two things and being known for, doing those things really well, right? So prioritize. Okay, I think, did you have a question? Daisy, where's Mike? We've lost one question just here.
That was Afra Atik's fault. She was distracting me.
Okay, I'm sorry. She'll recite a poem for you. Okay, gentleman is here.
Okay, thank you so much for the presentation. My question was really regarding myself personally. So I'm a very distracted person naturally, not just with the device and everything. And usually when I'm working, even if it's like I'm focusing on a single task or even having a normal conversation, usually my head's like racing in like 7 or 8 different directions. So I have a hard time really focusing on one thing.
Right.
And I really don't know how to handle that regardless of whether I use or not use my device. So
okay, so when your mind is constantly racing and you're thinking about different things, look, so I have a daytime job, right, which pays the bills, and I also I'm a novelist, right? So sometimes in the daytime, I'll think about like a plot or a character, right? So remember, your mind is for having ideas. Your mind is for having ideas. Your mind is not for holding ideas. So as soon as you have an idea, externalize it, write it down. Because if the idea is being held in your brain, that's creating stress. So your mind is racing. Have paper, write it down, externalize it. It'll relax you. It brings you back to what you're doing then, right? Rather than thinking about all these things. Externalize it. Your mind is for having ideas, not for holding ideas. Okay?
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're done for time. But if anyone has any other questions, I'll be
I'm just
around,
trying
I
to
think,
see
on
what the
this side for the books. So just feel free to come and ask because it's a problem that we all face, right? So we can all help each other out here. So thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, Rehan's book has been so popular at Magrudy's, who are our official booksellers. We only have 2 copies left. That's how many you've sold. We do have Rehan's other books, and Magrudy's is also taking orders for Rehan's book. But as he said, I'm sure he's very amenable to answering questions round at the signing stage. So we're going to see him over there if you'd like to make your way over there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.